This is odd timing, of course, but going alphabetically, so this is what happens. And alphabetically speaking, we're up to Boston. So while I've ripped on their ownership over the last couple of days, we're now going to look at the best of the Bruins. So we won't have to mention ownership in this because you're better off if you don't. And I had decided against making any changes to the format. So still the giant logos, still the smaller board. And by smaller, I mean I have bigger boards than this. Obviously, the Power Rankings board, and then the history videos. I was using that huge board last summer. Not using that for these. I don't want these to be overly long or complicated, and I kind of want everything to be the same. So if you watch any one video in this series, it's going to be the same as the others. So for the original 6, I could have done it different, but it just would have meant longer videos and potentially 2 entries for each, and I didn't want to do that. I want to talk about the best. And with the best with the Bruins, it is kind of tough to pick out a best player. And yet it has to be Bobby Orr, doesn't it? Bobby Orr doesn't show up on the all-time list at the top. But Bobby Orr transformed how defensemen were seen in the game and put up an insane amount of points. And, you know, before the 80s live puck era, there was kind of a live puck era that happened during the 70s as well. It kind of crops up when expansion happens. Expansion has often throughout history caused more goals to show up until that bizarreness, which was the trapping of the mid-90s, and then it just seemed to get worse in the early 2000s where everybody was clutching and grabbing. But Bobby Orr benefited from a league that doubled in size, and it got a little bit easier for him to get through. Not to take anything away from what he did. Absolutely fantastic. Best Bruin of all time. We can have the argument over whether or not he's the best player of all time in some other video. But the overall points leader is Ray Bourque, 1,506. And I can't take anything away from Bourque either. Bourque was, in his time, he was one of my favorite players in the league, and he was one of the best defensemen every single year. He was fantastic. And he could play at his end as well as he could play in the other end. And that's the really important thing, is not just the points, it's being able to play defensively, and Bourque was good at that as well. Your all-time goals leader is Johnny Bucyk with 545. Bucyk seemed to get better as he got older, and he played for a long time in the NHL, which is how you get to 545 for him. Assists, Ray Bourque, 1,111. Again, nothing really to add there other than he could pass, really could. Penalty minutes, Terry O'Reilly with 2,095. We talk a lot about power forwards in the game and all this, and back in the 70s, they were just players. A guy who could score goals and get penalty minutes, that was just the way it worked. So yeah, for O'Reilly, 2,095 penalty minutes as a Boston Bruin. He was a pretty intimidating figure out there, and he could put the puck in the net as well. Power play goals, Ray Bourque, 164. All-time leader for the Boston Bruins in that category. That's a pretty good list, dominated by Bourque. So when we talk about the all-time greatest, you have to mention Orr, as I said. You have to mention Phil Esposito, arguably the greatest goal scorer they had. Yes, Johnny Bucyk leads the all-time list, but you know, Esposito is just absolutely on another level certain seasons in the NHL. So while we can talk about Pastrnak, who's not on the board technically, and what Pasternak's putting together to what looks like he could be a perennial 50-goal scorer, he's got a way before he gets mentioned in the same breath as Phil Esposito. He has a way to go to get there. Cam Neely, 50 goals in 50 games that one season. Absolute magic he had with Adam Oates. And it was kind of both, and this is something that it drives me nuts when I hear people talking about this. They will try to diminish the goal scorer by talking about the assist man, or they'll try to diminish the assists for the assist guy by talking about the goals from the goal scorer. Can we not just admit they're both really good at what they do? Like, it's bizarre, and you see that in the NHL with various arguments of, well, yeah, so-and-so has a lot of assists, but look whose line he's on. He's just passing it to that guy. Well, yeah, he has a lot of goals, but it's because that guy's feeding him the puck all the time. Can we just admit they're both pretty good? And in this case, it was Oates, it was Neely, and right from day one, as long as Neely was healthy, which was the problem with Cam Neely, was being able to stay healthy, he was a goal machine. So he's on the board there. Middleton's on the board. He's kind of forgotten when you talk about all-time great Bruins. He scored over 900 points with the Boston Bruins. Zdeno Chara, of course, his era started with him signing a huge contract in Boston. and the first year wasn't so great, and there were a lot of people panning that contract, but by the time the next season was finished, that all stopped, and it was seen as a genius move down the road, and of course, he played a major role in the Boston Bruins winning the Stanley Cup in 2011. Patrice Bergeron, cannot diminish what Patrice Bergeron's meant to this team for a very long time. You're not going to mention him in the same breath as Bobby Orr or Ray Bourque, but you know what, as a two-way forward, and just for the sheer skill of it and the fact he's putting up point-a-game totals at this stage of his career, Bergeron has been fantastic. Wayne Cashman, a captain for this team throughout the 70s, a lot of the 70s anyways, and a pretty major part of their attack. They had a lot of good goal scorers in the 70s, and Cashman was one of them. Eddie Shore, the original bad boy in the NHL, if you want to call him that, for putting guys in the hospital. I have the feeling that if video footage from Eddie Shore's era existed now, he would have been banned for life. I don't have a whole lot of doubt. When I went through the NHL history videos and I was going through Eddie Shore's suspension history and some of the things he did, I thought, now he would probably just get thrown out of the league. Dirty player, also one of the best players in the NHL. So it was one of those situations where he was really dangerous, both in the positive and definitely in the negative. Bobby Bauer, I talked about him a lot when I was doing the history videos 2 summers ago. Bobby Bauer of the Boston Bruins. It just sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Yes, Bobby Bauer of the Boston Bruins. So he's on the board, and Cooney Welland, who was captain for the team as well, I want to say back in the 1920s. So yeah, nice long history for the Boston Bruins. And all of these guys could make an argument that belong in the conversation for the greatest and for what they were able to do in their time in Boston. And there are others I could have put up there, but I tried to keep it relatively short of a list. Wins leader all time is Tuukka Rask with 291. So this stoppage that we're currently in cost him a shot at 300 wins before the season was over, or at least getting closer to it before the season was over. Save percentage leader, that's also Rask with a .922 percentage of saves in his career. Save percentage in his career. Less awkward way of putting it. Shots against, Tuukka Rask leads there, 14,874 shots against. So, thanks Toronto, I guess. Shutouts, Tiny Thompson with 74. And, of course, Thompson played in a day and age where they weren't tracking shots against. And those numbers from back then aren't quite as reliable. Not that they're 100% reliable now either. I still hear complaints. You'll hear, this guy saved 22 shots tonight, but we think there were more shots. They may not have been counting anything. So, Thompson definitely is one that you can talk about as being one of the greatest for the Boston Bruins. Also, Jerry Cheevers in the 70s. He had the famous Stitch mask. And on top of having a pretty cool mask, he was also a very good goaltender. Tim Thomas, not an overly long career as a starting goaltender in the National Hockey League. Very unlikely he ever reaches the Hall of Fame. But during a magical spring of 2011, nobody could touch him. He was fantastic and didn't need anybody to pump his tires either. So Thomas is on the board. Andy Moog's on the board. The Bruins went to the finals in 88 and 90. 90 it was Moog. 88 I believe it was mostly Lemelin that year. But the Bruins still went to Stanley Cup finals twice with him on the roster. And he's been my favorite goalie for a long time. When I became a Bruins fan, Moog was kind of the face of that. I had been a fan of his in Edmonton. So you have Cam Neely going to Boston, one of my favorite Canucks. You have Andy Moog, arguably my favorite goaltender at the time that didn't play for Vancouver, going to Boston. It was natural that I would start pulling for the Bruins. Frank Brimsek. So if we're looking way, way back, Brimsek definitely deserves to be on the board as one of the best goaltenders the Bruins have ever had. And Gilles Gilbert. So while we talk about Middleton and him being maybe lost in the shuffle, it's easy to kind of lose Gilbert in the shuffle as well. But he put up some pretty decent totals as a Boston Bruins netminder. It is surprising they haven't had a 300-win goalie, but Tuukka Rask is going to change that soon. Very, very soon. Notable captains, Zdeno Chara, of course, their current captain, been a captain for quite a while. Joe Thornton did become captain. I know people are going to say, why don't you have Thornton under the greatest? For the same reason I didn't have Solani under the greatest for Arizona, because a majority of his success was somewhere else. And a majority of Solani's success was in Anaheim. And I know Solani had that great first season, but he would leave Winnipeg once he wanted some money, and once they realized that they couldn't afford to keep him. So with Thornton, that's not why they got rid of him. They got rid of him because their general manager at the time was a guy I didn't like, and he made a trade that I didn't like either. Yeah, that's all I got to say about that. Of course, Bork was captain for a very long time. Wayne Cashman, Johnny Busick, Fern Flaman as well. Milt Schmidt. So Schmidt I don't have under the notables, but that Kraut line, that was a pretty fantastic line overall, and it had Bobby Bauer on it. So I could maybe throw the Kraut line. See, again, this is where when you've got a team with that long of a history, trying to keep it simple, you got to make some cuts, and I apologize to the Kraut line. Dick Clapper as well. Clapper was with the team for a while, and again, Hall of Fame level talent. So the best team, when I was going through their history and going through best team for a franchise that's been around for that long, I had to go with the 71-72 Bruins that won the Stanley Cup. They didn't have as many points as the year before, but they won the Stanley Cup. That was with Esposito or Busick, Cheevers, all future Hall of Famers on their roster. I can't argue in favor of the 2011 Bruins. I can't. The 72 Bruins were, in my eyes, the best team they've had. Most wins versus any one team. That's where the Toronto Maple Leafs come into this conversation. They have 301 wins against the Toronto Maple Leafs. But in terms of point percentage, their best points percentage is against the Arizona Coyotes, formerly Winnipeg Jets, at 704. So they like playing Arizona. Goals for, they've scored the most goals against the New York Rangers, 2,051. Goals per game, they've scored the most against the Kings, 3.94. Yes, Vancouver's near the top, but LA's at the top at 3.94. Goals against per game, Nashville, 2.42 goals against per game they've played against Nashville over their history. With an asterisk, against Vegas, they play very well. Their winning percentage at 5-1 is higher than that 704. Their goals against per game, 2.00, is lower than against Nashville, but I felt it was a much smaller sample size, and so I just put it up there with the asterisk rather than making that one the one I'm officially recognizing. Because, yeah, most points that the teams had in a season was in 70-71 with 121 points. As great a season as the Bruins were having in 2019-2020, they weren't going to get to 121 points. That just wasn't going to happen. Longest playoff streak, of course, this is the NHL record from 1968 to 1996. The longest streak of 29 seasons in a row that they made the playoffs. So that's a pretty solid streak for the Boston Bruins that I don't think anybody else ever gets closer to. Because we now have a league that will soon be 32 strong with 16 making the playoffs, unless they expand the playoffs, nobody's ever going to get 29 years in a row in the playoffs. Not where half the league misses the playoffs. So they are helped in some part by the fact that more teams made the playoffs back then, and it's a record nobody will ever touch. The best coach, how could I not go with Art Ross? Best GM, how could I not go with Art Ross? Art Ross was the GM of this team from 1924 to 1954, and he was a coach for a large portion of that as well. He was the Boston Bruins. Art Ross put it together. They won Stanley Cups with him in charge. And really, when I went through and I did the history of the Bruins, when I did season by season history as well, yeah, Art Ross was a dominant figure in the NHL. And there's a reason that they've got trophies named after him. He is absolutely a dominant figure. And I wanted to give an honorable mention to Harry Sinden, who was the general manager for the Bruins for a very long time. Harry Sinden kept the team in the playoffs for ages. And he had his moments of greatness and moments of not so much. But you know what? Harry Sinden, yeah, I will give him his due and say honorable mention below Art Ross. And no, I don't have Don Sweeney in that level. It would take a long time for Don Sweeney to reach the level of Art Ross or Harry Sinden. So if anybody asks, that's the end of that. And for coach, I don't see. I thought about Claude Julien for coach, but I couldn't put his resume up against Art Ross. I couldn't. And then in the he was a Bruin category, I came up with some more today than I did in the last two, because of course there's a lot. I even skipped over a couple because I'm like, man, I don't want there to be too many in here. Terry Crisp had a very short career as a Boston Bruin. I believe it was 3 games, but still, he went on to become coach of the Flames. He's a personality now on TV for the Nashville Predators. He was a Bruin very, very briefly, and of course, he was part of the Philadelphia Flyers in the 70s as well. Rick Nash. Now, people watching this are going to be like, well, we know Nash was on the team, but we're going to get to the point where a few years down the road, that's kind of forgotten that the Bruins picked him up at the deadline. He only played 11 regular season games as a Bruin. So I put him up on the board because it's going to be easy to forget down the road that he was a member of the Bruins. Brian Propp. I loved Propp as a Bruin. I was actually upset that he didn't stay in Boston. He was one of those guys who they picked up and it just worked. And he was part of a Stanley Cup Finals run. Alexei Kasatonov. So when the Russian 5 came over, or Soviet 5 at the time, Kasatonov was the 5th member. He was the one that was kind of easy to forget. But you know what? I liked him a lot. So while Fedosov was the better defenseman overall, I thought Kasatonov was a very good defenseman, and it is easy to forget that he did play with Boston before he officially retired, as well as Al Iafrate. I remember when Iafrate came over and played for the Bruins, and it was just fantastic, absolute magic right away. And you see him in a Bruins jersey, and you go, Al should have been wearing that jersey earlier than he did. He should have been a Bruin for like 5, 6, 7 years, and sadly, only 12 regular season games in a Bruins uniform. Chris Nyland. Nyland has been outspoken about how, having been a Montreal Canadian for as long as he was, it felt wrong to be a Boston Bruin. He felt wrong about it, and of course he infamously was picked for the All-Star game by Coach Mike Milbury. And Chris Nyland, Boston Bruin, it just looked weird. It didn't look right at the time. I will definitely do at some point a countdown of players that didn't look right to see them in a jersey that we never thought we'd see them in. Kevin Stevens. Kevin Stevens went to Boston. He was a Massachusetts boy, but at the time he went to Boston, he was no longer the player he'd been in Pittsburgh. And again, I'm looking at guys that over their careers, it could be easy to forget that Kevin Stevens had played in Boston. Butch Goring. Yep, he played a half a season in Boston. He's known for being a large part of the 4 cups in a row for the New York Islanders. He'd go on to coach the Bruins as well. Brian Leetch. Yeah, he was a Boston Bruin for a year, and that was at the end of his career. But it was strange to see him as a Bruin after all those years of not being a huge fan of the Rangers for what they did in '94. To then see him as a Bruin, it was weird. Rick Tocchet, yeah, he was a Bruin, and he's another one that when he put on a Bruins jersey, you could look at it and go, and that's what he should have been wearing a long time ago. When you get a guy who can fight, when you get a guy who's good offensively, and he's a glue guy for the team, you just go, and that's a Bruin. That could be a video at some point, too, where we discuss what is the makeup of the ideal player for each team, because some teams would be more of a skill guy, and for some teams, like the Bruins, be more of a tough guy that can score. In Philly's case, it'd be just who punches really well. Because over their history, that's kind of been where, and right or wrong, that's kind of been what Philly's been known for. And yet right now they have a team that doesn't fight. Thomas Gradin and Petr Skriko, I put them on the board back to back. And again, this goes back to my fandom in the 80s. Gradin had been a Canuck his whole career, goes to Boston, retires. Skriko had been a Canuck his whole career, goes to Boston, leaves. And so it kind of became, in my eyes, where Canucks went for their career when it was over. Brent Ashton was another one. Boston and out. So it definitely made it easier for me to cheer for the Bruins when they had Gradin on the team, when they had Skriko on the team, because I had cheered for them as Canucks for a long time. And, you go from one team that wears black and yellow to another team that wears black and yellow. It just feels like a natural progression. You just lose the red from the Canucks jerseys, and you go to the white of the Bruins jerseys. Now, at the time, Vancouver technically was black, orange, and gold, but I know that I've discussed that before. So, Jerome McGinley's the last one on the board. Jerome McGinley as well. We know that he was a Bruin, for those of us who, have watched hockey for a long time. But I look at Iginla and I think, you know what? 15, 20 years from now, it would be easy for people to forget that he did play with the Bruins. And again, he looked like a Bruin once he put that jersey on. I remember when Adam Oates went to Boston and they had a coach's corner, and Don Cherry said, he just looks like a Bruin. I don't know what a Bruin looks like necessarily when it comes to players, but he looks like one. And there are certain players that when they put on a jersey, you go, hey, that's what. So that's another good video idea as well, guys. When they put on a different jersey, you suddenly go, "Hey, that's what they should have wore their whole career. That's what they should have been wearing." So no offense to Blues fans here, but when Adam Oates put on a Bruins jersey, I kind of felt this pride in that moment where I'm like, "Hey, that looks nice. I like that. That's fantastic." Unlike when certain players would go from one team that I liked to another one that I didn't want them anymore on teams that I cheered for. I'd be like, I just booed you out of Boston. Why are you in Vancouver now? Oh, I didn't like him in Vancouver. Why is he in Dallas? That kind of thing. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff to talk about. So, Boston Bruins, their greatest of all time is Bobby Orr. But there are a lot of notables in there as well. And I'd be interested to know from fans or not fans, your favorites, least favorites, and all that other wonderful stuff. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And again, all-time greats. Thank you guys so much for all your support. And I will talk to you again soon.